Good morning, everybody, and happy Thursday. My name is Lindsey Funtik, and I am the coordinator of volunteer ministries at Ashland First United Methodist Church. And every Thursday, I hop on here to share a little bit about what the Lord is teaching me and some of my devotional thoughts for this week. So, welcome this morning. Before I begin, I would be remiss. The news is circulating on Facebook around the state of Ohio about the loss of our friend and our colleague, Jen Borman, in a tragic hit and run scenario. And we love Jen, and it's a lot to process. And times like these bring up a lot of questions and a lot of just feelings and grief, and a lot of which I'm still processing myself, but it is fresh. This is new. And for those of you who want to process alongside me, please join me in that. And that's kind of right now what I have to say about it, but we want to acknowledge that. We want to remember Jen, and we want to draw near to the Lord, who is close to the brokenhearted. So, as I talk about my devotion for this week, I am thinking a lot about this idea of rebuilding. So, as we are coming out of the COVID pandemic, here in Ohio, we're not really feeling as much of those effects anymore. I think it's important that we are sensitive to those around the world who are still struggling very mightily with this pandemic. But in my little towns of Shreve and Ashland and Polk, I'm not really feeling those day-to-day effects. Having been vaccinated, I don't have to wear a mask. Social distancing is not as heavily enforced anymore. So we're kind of moving into a sense of quote unquote normalcy. But also, I think it's been interesting as I've been processing it, that I also feel a sort of heaviness, that it feels like we went from shut really tight to wide open overnight. And as I've been kind of rebuilding my calendar into something that looks like it did post or pre-pandemic, I'm realizing that it's kind of hard. It's kind of hard to shift back into the schedules that we all kept. I think that we sometimes underestimate the effect that the pandemic had on us, the scars that we might walk away with. And so while there's a lot of joy in rebuilding and as the world begins to look a bit more like we once knew it, I think it's also important to acknowledge the difficulty that comes with rebuilding, and to acknowledge those feelings that we might be having as we're trying to get back to where we once were. So I want to acknowledge that this morning. And I've been reading through, I started studying the book of Ezra, which I've read the sister book, Nehemiah. They were once kind of considered one book. But Ezra had always kind of fallen under my radar. So I started reading Ezra, and it got me really thinking a lot about the idea of rebuilding, because it is the account of the Israelites coming out of exile back into Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. Cyrus, king of Persia, receives a word from the Lord that says, rebuild the temple. And so he sends out a decree that says, anybody who is willing, come and help with the effort. So this is a way in which the Israelites make their way back to where they once were, and were an attempt to rebuild. And so all of a sudden they had been experiencing this season of banishment, of exile, and all of a sudden they were called right back into working to restore what they once knew, to restore the former glory. And that resonated with me. That felt familiar to me. And so the parallels here are not perfect. After all, being asked to follow health rules and stay in our homes is not the same as being forcefully run out of our homelands. So the exile they experienced and the exile we experienced are a little different. But there is still a lot that it can teach us about this process of rebuilding. And so this morning I wanted to just share a few things I pulled out. As always, I invite you to also read it and let's talk about it together. See what you pulled out, see what stood out to you. So the first thing in Ezra chapter 1, and I should know I've not finished my study of Ezra, so stay tuned. But in 1:5, it says that the people who helped with the cause of rebuilding the temple was everyone whose heart God had moved. And I really liked that because it seems to me to highlight the necessity of God's movement in our lives in order to do this well. To come out of a pandemic, to rebuild life as we knew it, to try to heal. We can't do that in our own strength. God had to move their hearts to want to leave exile, to want to start to rebuild, to want to start to heal. And in the same way, we need God's help as we seek to step out of this season of life. I know that as I feel the heaviness of trying to adjust and change and get back to normalcy, I need the Lord's strength for that. I can't do that on my own. So in that, I see God move their hearts, and God is moving my heart, and I need Him to continue to move it. So that this is healthy and so that this is good. So the second thing is that another piece of King Cyrus's announcement when he makes this decree is that the neighbors of those who are going to assist should provide silver and gold and goods and livestock and other kinds of gifts to the folks that were coming to help rebuild the temple. And that serves very practical purposes. But in this, two things. First, I see provision for what the Lord calls us to. So if the Lord is calling us to rebuild right now, if the Lord is calling us to step into a season of healing in various ways, the Lord will provide what we need for that. So I see that affirmation there, that the Lord not only moves our hearts and walks with us, but He provides what we need in order for that journey to be healthy and successful. And on the other side of that too, I see here the importance of loving your neighbors. I think that in a lot of ways, the pandemic was sort of a crucible for those who want to seek to love their neighbors. There's been a lot of conversation about that. And I see here a loving of neighbors in the rebuilding process. So not only are we provided for as we seek to rebuild in a post-pandemic world, but also we are called to love our neighbors as we process that. I think about, for example, being like sensitive to the truth of variants and different sorts of developments in the pandemic as we are seeing them happen. There's fear and there's uncertainty. And so we can love each other through that. We can love each other through the unknown, and we can love each other through the process of stretching the muscles that have not been stretched in a long time. So love your neighbors, have compassion on them, and maybe you will be the Lord's provision for them in their rebuilding process. So the next thing is there may be weeping. As we move through the story in the first few chapters of Ezra, when the foundation for the new temple is laid, there is much rejoicing. There's a joyful noise being raised. All of those folks were so excited. But they say that the sounds of the joy were mingled with sounds of sorrow for those who had seen the former temple. And they said that noise can be heard from far away. So even as there's a lot of joy in the rebuilding, there is also going to be weeping. There are scars we all carry out of this. There are thousands upon thousands of people who are mourning loved ones who lost their lives to the virus. There are people who are still struggling in different areas of the world. I don't feel the day-to-day effects here in Ashland, Shreve, Polk, wherever I might be in the moment, but it still is a present entity in the world. And so while we feel joy, I feel joy in being able to go to coffee shops again. I feel joy in the fact that the library is open. I feel joy in the fact that John gets to join me for ultrasounds to look at our baby. There's also a lot of weeping. And I love that the sounds commingled because We need to make space for both the sorrow and the rejoicing that is happening on the other side of this pandemic. The next thing is that there may be opposition. So most of Ezra chapter 4 are letters from folks who do not want this project to go forward. So they use creative rhetoric and fear-mongering and appeal to the powers that be to make sure that the temple does not get rebuilt. And in this, I see a parallel. There might be opposition from the outside. There might be letters written about what we might be trying to do. But I think there's also a lot of opposition that comes to us internally in the form of lies that we tend to believe, that tend to discourage us. So in our rebuilding process, in the name of Jesus, we refute those lies, those voices, which might try to tell us that this is not worthwhile and that healing cannot happen. So we refute those. And finally, in the end, I skipped ahead, it gets rebuilt. Despite opposition, despite sorrow, despite difficulty, it gets rebuilt. And I think that is the biggest piece of encouragement for us today. This is hard. It's hard to come out of a pandemic. It is hard to rebuild. It's hard to heal. It's hard to walk through grief of all kinds. But the Lord is with us, and the mission He has called us to will be brought to completion. So may we enter the world with patience and kindness for ourselves and for others. And may we have eyes and hearts that are wide open. And may we courageously step into the process of rebuilding. So with that, friends, Ashland First United Methodist, I love you. I'm thinking of you. I'm praying for you. And I look forward to seeing you all, to rebuilding together and seeing you all very soon.